students, good morning. We have a very special opportunity today to hear something from the first hand, to hear about the background of Jesus in his Jewish milieu. And our guest today, our professor, is Professor Yonatan Bourgel. We just spoke, it's Bourgel. So later you can also ask questions, you can also learn more. Professor Yonatan Bourgel is from France, from Israel, but now in Canada, in the Laval University, and he's expert about Judaism, about Jewish Christianity, and also about this period of time, the time of Jesus, the time of first Christians. Professor Yonatan Bourgel said he prepared many pictures, so we can see also very beautiful views from this time. If you have some questions, if you have some words you don't know, you can ask also every time. We are here also to help to translate. 如果你们有些字听不懂，那也马上可以问，好吧 I hope you can also see it in the PPT. Please think about your questions. 对，请你们好好想一想，以后要问什么问题，当然用英文要问，用中文也可以，我们可以翻译。Okay, I don't use the time of Professor Bourgel. Professor Bourgel, thank you for coming. A big applause for Professor Bourgel. We ask for your lecture and explanations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The generous introduction. Hello everyone. So I'll speak in English to my best to be as clear as possible. So today we're going to talk about the religious context in which Jesus emerges. Okay? I assume that you have had the opportunity to speak about Jesus, saying that Christianity is built around the figure of Jesus and his message. And you probably know that our primary source in the New Testament, the Holy Christian Scriptures, and maybe more specifically, the Gospels. But we'll see that we can gain insight into Christianity by exploring Jesus' context. What do I mean by context? It can mean many different things. It can be the places that Jesus visited. It can be the people that surrounded him. It can be also the material culture as revealed by archaeology. So you see that the context can mean many different things. But today we'll focus on the religious context of Jesus, what is called Second Temple Judaism. I assume that you know that Jesus was Jewish. Jesus was raised as a Jew. His disciples, his first disciples were Jews. And Christianity, as it emerged, appeared as a Jewish group. At first, during the first decades, Christianity was a Jewish group. Okay? So it will be very important for us to learn about this form of Judaism. To learn about the Judaism that Jesus has experienced. Okay? Is everything clear? So, we'll focus on three main features. The Jerusalem Temple, which was the worship center at the time of Jesus. The synagogue, which was the place where Jews gathered for worship or for community needs. And we'll see that Judaism at the time of Jesus was divided into different movements. Actually, Christianity, as it appears, is just one of those movements. Okay, so that's our program. But first, before diving into this topic, we have to say a few words about the geographical context and the historical context. Okay? Some geographical data. So I invite you to look at this map. This map which represents the land of Israel. The land of Israel is the homeland of Jesus. And please have a look at this map. Does anything stand out to you regarding the location of the land of Israel? What is striking about the location of the land of Israel? As you can see, the land of Israel is situated at the crossroads of three continents. Asia to the east, Africa to the southwest, and Europe to the northwest. Why is it so important to stress this point? Why is it so important to stress the fact that the land of Israel occupies a strategic position? Because it explains much of its history. The land of Israel, because of its strategic location, is doomed to be conquered. And throughout its history, the land of Israel has been conquered many times. And think about it. Any empire looking to expand itself into another continent had first to conquer the land of Israel. Okay, so that's the first feature that we have to keep in mind. Because of its strategic location, the land of Israel is doomed to be conquered repeatedly. The second point, now if we look closer, we'll see that, first of all, the dimension. See that this territory is a rather small territory. And yet, the land of Israel is divided into different regions that are distinct from one another. See the Galilee? The Galilee is the place where Jesus was, I won't say born, because we have different accounts about his birth, but he was raised. Okay? Samaria, Judea, which is the region surrounding Jerusalem. And just to get a sense of this diversity, let's imagine that we're landing. Okay, so that's the reality. Let's imagine that we're landing on the shoreline of this territory. You see that? What do we see at first? A plain, a fertile plain. What you see here is the modern city of Tel-Aviv, and here is the ancient city of Yafo. So that's the first thing that you see as you land on the shoreline. And if you keep moving eastward, you'll have to climb on a ridge. See, here is the central ridge that actually divides the country in two parts. I'll show you. What you see here is the Judean mountains around Jerusalem. And here, the Galilee. The Galilee, which is the homeland of Jesus. Now, let's imagine that we keep moving eastward. Quite surprisingly, we'll have to cross a desert, the Judean desert, that stretches from Jerusalem till the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. So you can see that there is a great diversity in the land of Israel. Despite its smallness, the land of Israel is divided into regions, and this diversity may contribute to explain the fact that within this small territory, different civilizations have developed, different cultures. And this is certainly the case at the time of Jesus. At the time of Jesus, the land of Israel was inhabited by a wide Jewish majority alongside a significant non-Jewish minority. Okay, so you see how by examining the geography of the territory, we can get some insight, we can gain insight into his history. Everything clear so far? Yeah, any question? No questions? Okay, so now that we have dealt with geography, we have to set some historical markers. Okay? You all know that Jesus lived in the first century CE, but generally speaking, Jesus lived during what is referred to the Second Temple period. Why is that? What does the period of the Second Temple refer to? This is what we'll see in the coming minutes. Okay. The Second Temple period spanned over 600 years, lasting as long as the Second Temple of Jerusalem remained in operation. Of course, we won't have time to get into all details, but we have to highlight and to stress several key points. First, if there were a Second Temple in Jerusalem, it means quite logically that it had been the first temple. The first temple of Jerusalem had been destroyed in the year 586 BCE by the Babylonians. Babylonians were the most powerful empire of the time, and they managed to conquer Jerusalem and to destroy its temple. And following the destruction of the first temple, part of the population was taken into exile in Babylon. Okay, so Jews were in exile till another empire raised, the Persian Empire. Do you remember what we said about the strategic location of this territory? Which explained the fact that it has been conquered repeatedly. So this is what we see here. The Persian Empire, with its king, Cyrus, will let the Jews go back to Jerusalem and restore their temple. This is the Second Temple. Jews go back to Jerusalem, they rebuild that temple. This is the Second Temple of Jerusalem. So that's the first period that we had to stress. The second one, if you look at this timeline, you probably notice that the Second Temple period was divided into sub-periods corresponding to the successive phases of occupation. First, the Persians, then the new empire arose, the Greek Empire, and Alexander the Great. Following the Hellenistic period, the Hasmonean period, which is very important. The Hasmonean period begins when a Greek king named Antiochus Epiphanes, decides to persecute Judaism, decides to forbid Judaism. Why? In order to force the Jews to adopt the Greek culture. Not only did he forbid Judaism, he also defied the temple in Jerusalem. And the Jews reacted in different ways. Some of them actually accepted willingly the Greek culture, which meant for them progress. Others preferred to die. They preferred to die than forsaking their faith, forsaking their culture. And yet others decided to revolt. They decided to fight back. They were led by a family named the Hasmoneans, who managed, against all odds, to defeat the Greek army. They defeated the Greek army, freed the temple, and over the generation, they managed to establish a kingdom in the land of Israel. The Jewish independent kingdom in the land of Israel. So we have to keep in mind first that this period begins with the persecution of Judaism. And two, that by fighting, the Jews managed to defeat the Greeks. And of course, from the perspective of many Jews, this victory was possible only because God helped them. So we have to keep that in mind, because it sets the precedent. But, as we have seen, the land of Israel is exposed to conquest. The Hasmonean kingdom was short-living, and after about 80 years, it fell with the Roman conquest. the Romans are the new power in the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea, and in 63 BCE, they conquer the Hasmonean kingdom. Now, for many Jews, this conquest is unbearable. Many Jews had great difficulty renouncing their independence. On the other hand, the Romans had great difficulties understanding the specifics of the Jews, understanding their customs, understanding their religion. And these two features will shape the relationship between Jews and Romans over the next 2 centuries. At first, the Romans decide to rule indirectly. What does it mean? It means that they rule by appointing local kings, the most famous of whom is Herod the Great, whom you probably heard, was mentioned in the Gospels. Herod the Great was very shrewd, very smart, and managed to calm the tensions in Judea. But also very cruel. Herod the Great is a builder as well. You see that he's the one who has expanded and beautified the temple of Jerusalem. But after the death of Herod the Great, the Romans faced unrest. And they decided to change the form of governance. In the year 6, they decided to rule directly, to turn Judea into a province. That means to establish their administration, their officials, and to govern directly Judea. And the very purpose of this change was to calm the tension, to stabilize the territory. But actually, it had the opposite effect. And from then on, the situation keeps deteriorating, keeps worsening. And this is actually the time when Jesus appeared. When Jesus appears, the Roman rule at least part of the land of Israel directly. And as I said, the situation keeps worsening until a major revolt breaks out in the year 66. A major revolt of the Jews against the Romans, at the end of which the temple is destroyed. And this is a catastrophe for Judaism. We'll talk about the temple and we'll see that the destruction of the temple is a turning point in the history of Judaism. Okay, and actually it will bring the appearance of a new form of Judaism. Okay? So that's the historical context within which Jesus appears. When Jesus appears, Jews live under Roman occupation, which is for many Jews unbearable. Tension rises. This is a world that Jesus loved. And Jesus has to face all this issue and shares these concerns. Okay? Is everything clear? Okay. Just a word about our primary source. This is a historian that we have to know. Flavius Josephus, which was a Jewish historian, was born in Jerusalem. He actually took part in the Great Revolt, surrendered to the Roman, and finished his life in Rome, where he wrote 4 major books. Actually, the most important, the Jewish War and the Antiquities of the Jews, which are our primary sources for exploring this period of time. Okay, so now we have discussed the geographical context, the historical context as well. Now we can dive into the core topic, that is the Second Temple Judaism. I think that to begin with, we should probably highlight what were the main beliefs, and are still the main belief, the main foundation of Judaism. First of all, the monotheism. Judaism is a monotheistic faith. Can anyone explain what it means? What is monotheism?
We have
to us directly. Natan, do you know what is monotheism? What does it mean? I know everybody knows, so please. Okay, and in English? Yeah, monotheism means that there is only
one God.
I think it means that Jews believe in the existence of one and only God. God that is the creator of all things. God that is omniscient. It means that He's all-knowing, omnipotent. It means that He's all-powerful. Think about that. At the time, Judaism was an exception. All the religions around were polytheistic, meaning that they accepted the existence of multiple gods. So that's the first step, that first main belief. This belief in the existence of one God. The second belief is that God has established a covenant, an alliance with the people of Israel. To make it simple, the people of Israel is the Jewish people, okay? So, according to Judaism, God has established covenant with the Jewish people. And like every covenant, this agreement is based on a system of reciprocal obligation and commitment. It means that God bestows His blessing, His protection to the Jewish people, if in return the Jewish people adhere to some obligation. What are those obligations? They are recorded in the Torah. Have you heard of that? Torah? You can answer in Chinese if you want. I'll choose later. Does anyone know?
Torah is in Chinese. Hold on.
It is the holiest scriptures in Judaism. According to Judaism, the Torah was given by God to Moses. Moses is the greatest prophet in Judaism. And so God gave the Torah to Moses through a revelation. And the Torah includes not only a story, so it starts with the creation of the world, it includes as well commandments, what we call in Hebrew mitzvot. Mitzvot are the commandments that Jews had to adhere to in order to remain worthy of the covenant of Israel. Okay? Is everything clear? Yes? Okay. So, now we'll dive into the first of our three topics, the Jerusalem Temple. So here's a view of Jerusalem today, the old city of Jerusalem, which is divided in 4 quarters. And here is a reconstruction of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. Jerusalem is the holiest city for Jews, and Jerusalem lives by the temple. The temple is the heart of the city. So here is another reconstruction of the temple. The temple is located on a mount whose summit has been flattened into a platform. It covers an area of 144,000 square meters, and it is actually at the time the largest religious structure in the Roman world. We try to understand its function, its importance, and its function. So this is another reconstruction. Just a word about the Temple Mount today. This is the Western Wall. Okay, this is today the holiest site for Jews, and as you can see, it is actually the remain of one of the retaining walls that were built to create this platform. Okay, this is not even a part of the temple. The temple has been fully destroyed. But it is a part of the retaining wall of the platform. Okay? Okay. Now, what did the temple represent? Well, just a word about that. You can see in the Gospels, it is reported that Jesus himself visited the temple. And it's not a surprise. Jesus was Jew, and like other Jews, from time to time, he went to the temple. Okay? What did the temple represent for Jews in Jesus' time? The temple is the place that God has chosen to be venerated. This is the only place that God has chosen to be venerated. Think about that. I mean, Taiwan is the only to me, but I see all around temples. All around, which is beautiful. According to Judaism, there is only one temple. This is a temple in Jerusalem. This is a place that God himself has chosen to be venerated. The temple is the dwelling place of God's presence on earth. This is a meeting point between the earth and the heaven. This is a place where Jews, and actually also non-Jews, can approach God with the mediation of the priest. We'll talk about the priests and their important specific function. And this is the only place where Jews are allowed to perform sacrifices to God. So now you understand, you get a sense of the importance of this place, of the temple for Jews. Now, let's say a few words about the functioning of the temple. The temple is structured in zones of gradually increasing sanctity. What does it mean? It means that the further you move toward the inner part of the temple, the higher the level of sanctity. And with the increased sanctity, the access becomes more restricted. And this is exactly what we'll see now. Let's imagine that we visit a temple. Let's take a tour on the temple mount. The first thing we'll see is the court of the Gentiles, the court of the non-Jews. It doesn't mean that only non-Jews had access to this court. It means that Jews and non-Jews could enter the court. Okay, so you see that non-Jews as well did visit Jerusalem to approach the God of Israel. What you see here is a royal store. It was obviously a monumental building where there was a market. Why? Why do you need to have a market on the temple mount? Any idea? Why so? Why can you buy there? Why can you purchase?
Offerings to God.
Offerings, exactly. Sacrifices, animals, lambs, doves. That's the place where you buy your sacrifices. That will be sacrificed by the priest in the temple. Now, let's move toward the inner part of the temple. At some point, you reach a small wall that is called the Soreg. What is the purpose of the Soreg? It marks the boundaries beyond which only Jews are allowed to go. Non-Jews are not allowed to go beyond this wall. Do you remember what we said? The further we move toward the inner part of the temple, the higher the sanctity, and the more restricted is the access. Okay? What's next? The court of the woman. It doesn't mean that only Jewish women were allowed to enter. It means that Jewish men and Jewish women were allowed to enter this court. But Jewish women were not allowed to enter the other part of the temple. Next is the court of Israel. And in order to understand why it is called so, we have to say a few words about the division of the Jewish people according to the biblical tradition. According to the biblical tradition, the people of Israel, the Jewish people, is divided into three categories. The priests, who form kind of aristocracy. The priests are those who perform sacrifices. And by the way, you cannot decide that you want to become a priest. You were born a priest. Access to the priesthood is through genealogy. It's not something that you decide to become. The Levites, they have the lower statute, and they are the one who assist the priest in the performing of sacrifices. Then Israel. Israel is actually any Jew who is neither a priest nor a Levite. So the court of Israel is a court that is accessible by any Jewish man. But if you want to go further, you're prevented. If you're not a priest nor a Levite, you cannot enter the next court, which is the court of the priest. Only priest and Levite can enter this court. What you see here is the place where was situated the main altar and where sacrifices were performed. Okay? And then this leads us to the building itself, the building that was divided into three parts, the holiest of which was the Holy of Holies. But now there is a question. Remember, we've seen that the further we move toward the inner part of the temple, the higher the level of sanctity, and the more the access is restricted, who is allowed to enter the Holy of Holies? Only one man. Only the high priest, the chief priest, is allowed to enter the Holy of Holies once a year on what is called Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. This is the most solemn day in the Jewish calendar. And the high priest enters the Holy of Holies to atone for the sins of the whole people. So you see, the holiest person in the people enters the holiest place during the holiest celebration. The Holy of Holies is seen as the dwelling place of God's presence. Okay? Is it clear so far? Okay. So we've seen that sacrifices play a central role in Second Temple Judaism. So we have to understand the function of sacrifices. It is not self-evident that you sacrifice an animal. By the way, there are different types of sacrifices. Animal sacrifices, grain sacrifices, voluntary sacrifices, mandatory sacrifices, individual sacrifices, and collective sacrifices. And we try to understand what were the functions of the sacrifices. And we'll see how central they were for the Judaism in the time of Jesus. So first, the word in Hebrew for sacrifice is korban. And like many Hebrew words, this word derived from the root, the three letters root, that is Kalev. Kalev means to approach. So you see, we may gain some insight, but one of the functions of sacrifices, merely by examining this word, to approach what? This is what we'll try to see. So usually, we can divide the functions of sacrifices into three categories. First, atonement. This is one of the key functions of sacrifices. You sacrifice to atone for your sin. Not anything, only involuntary sins. Sacrifices are seen as a way to remove sins, to cover them, a way to express repentance, a way to seek to repair the broken link with God. Okay, so that's one main function. When you talk about Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, we've seen that the high priest enters the Holy of Holies after he has performed sacrifices to atone for the sins of the people as a whole. The second function is fellowship. One of The other function of sacrifices is to foster fellowship between God and the offerer, and fellowship between the members of the community as well. And actually, this is an expression of joy. This is an expression of the living covenant between God and His people. And the last category is purification. Why did Jews purify themselves? What did they purify themselves from? This is what we'll try to understand. This concept, this key concept of purification. In order to understand the concept of purification, we have to touch on two other major concepts. According to Judaism, the creation, the world, is divided into two realms. The realm of the profane and the realm of the sacred. What is sacred? Anything that is divine. God, by sense, is sacred. What is profane? Anything that is foreign to God. Now, when a Jew wants to approach God, wants to enter the realm of the sacred, he has to be in a state of ritual purity. If he is ritually impure, he is not allowed to approach God, which means at the time that he is not allowed to go to the temple. So now the next question. What causes one to become ritually impure? What are the causes of ritual impurity? This is what we'll see now. We find in the Torah, in the Jewish Holy Scriptures, a list of causes of things that result into impurities. As you see, discharges from the genital organs. It can be the menstrual blood, it can be seminal fluids, contact with corpse. If you touch a dead body, then you're impure. And some skin infections. Actually, becoming ritually impure is not a sin in itself. You see that the normal circumstances of life will cause you at some point to become ritually impure. Once a month, women become ritually impure. What is sinful is to remain ritually impure. Why is it sinful? First, because impurity is seen as being contagious. And two, because when you're impure, you cannot access the temple, so you cannot worship God as you should. So what do you do once you are ritually impure? First, you have to wait a certain amount of time, depending on the cause of your impurity. Two, you have to perform a ritual bath. It is not coincidental that around the temple of Jerusalem, the site of the temple, were found many ritual baths. This is what we call in Hebrew mikveh, or mikvahot in plural. Because when Jews came to Jerusalem, they had to make sure that they were ritually pure to accept the temple. Okay? And eventually, people would perform sacrifice in order to state that they were ritually pure. Okay? Now there is a question that has intrigued scholars. If we go back to this list, is there an underlying conceptual system behind this list? And here I'll quote the work of Jonathan Clowes, who think that behind this list we find two concepts. The concept of death and the idea of sexuality. And what does Clowes, a very famous scholar, conclude from that? Say that these two things are the ones who distinguish human condition from the divine condition. God is eternal, he's not mortal, and God is not begotten. God, sexuality is foreign to God. So, when a Jew actually recovers in a state of ritual purity, he imitates God. He's making himself worthy to approach God. He's a little less human and a little more God. Is that clear? Yeah? Okay. There is another form of impurity, what we call moral impurity, which the more serious forms are sexual. Sexual transgressions, idolatry, and murder. Moral impurity is sinful, and according to Judaism, it results in the distancing of God. So you have two of those forces. On the one hand, you have the sacrifices, whose purpose is to maintain God's presence on earth. But on the other hand, moral impurity, which results in the distancing, in the removal of God. And when a certain amount of impurity, of moral impurity is reached, so God just leaves the temple, and the Jews, to that what they believe, are exposed to this is the way Jews conceive and understand their history. Okay? So now you understand how central the temple is in Judaism, how central were the sacrifices. So when the temple was destroyed by the Roman army in the year 70, Judaism was no longer a sacrificial rite. Because Jews, remember, the temple of Jerusalem is the only place where Jews are allowed to sacrifice. So once they were deprived of that temple, Jews could not perform sacrifices. And many believe that actually Judaism was under an existential threat. Judaism could have disappeared at this time. But this destruction has paved the way for new practices in replacement for sacrifices. And today's Judaism is based on prayer, study of the Torah, good deeds. But all that is a consequence of one event, the destruction of the temple. Okay? But remember that the world that Jesus knew was the world where the temple existed. And the Jews, as Christians, after the destruction of the temple, had to explain this major event. Okay? So maybe we should take a break.
So we can do it now. Yeah, this, I mean, in 10 minutes we come back. Okay, so please, 我们休息10分钟。OK， 请呼吸多一点，那10分钟之后我们来聊这里。
谢谢。
同学们，希望大家休息好了，让我们继续听我们的演讲。到现在有没有问题 ？Are there some questions? As I will be explaining, everything is clear. Okay, so let us continue. So we will really ask for the next step.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll talk about the temple. Now we'll discuss seven major institutions of Second Temple Judaism, synagogue. Till today, the synagogue is a major place for worship and community in Jewish life. But we see that as well during the Second Temple period, the synagogue was a major institution. And first, we may say a few words regarding the terminology. Because in our ancient sources, there are several words to refer to this institution. In Hebrew, we use the word Beit Knesset, while in Greek, we use the word synagogue. But they both have the same meaning, which is house of assembly. Okay? But there is another word, another Greek word that we find in our sources, that is Bourgel. It's a Greek word meaning prayer house. So you see that we can gain insight into the functions of the synagogue merely by examining the terminology we use in order to refer to this institution. Now, what are the origins of the synagogue? It is quite unclear. We don't know when the synagogue appeared. For some scholars, it appeared while Jews were in Babylon. Do you remember? It said that part of the Jews were taken in exile in Babylon, they were deprived of the temple, and it's maybe because of that they had to find a new way, to create a new institution to gather and to worship God. That's one possibility, but it may be as well that it appeared later, either during the Persian period or during the Hellenistic period. At any event, the earliest evidence we have regarding the existence of the synagogue comes from Egypt. And I think it's not by accident. There were Jewish communities outside the land of Israel. And there was a very important Jewish community in Egypt. And this is there that we find the earliest evidence from the 3rd century BCE. What you see here is a dedicatory inscription. You see that Jews dedicate their Bourgel, prayer house, to the king Tel-Aviv, king of Egypt. Okay? So we won't get into the details and the meaning of this inscription. It's enough to say that we have here clear evidence of the existence of the synagogue of the Bourgel at this time. Now, if we look into our literary sources, first, if you look into the Gospel, you will see that Jesus himself visited synagogues. Appears clearly in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus taught. Jesus made great deeds in the synagogue. It's also relevant to refer to Paul. Do you know who Paul was? Yes? Can you tell a little about Paul? Even in Chinese.
Yeah, everybody heard about Paul or Paul. That's the Jews.
Yeah.
Paul is a person.
He's a person.
Is a good man.
That's a good man. Okay, but what did he do? What did Paul do?
Okay. Kill. Or he killed people who believe Christ.
Persecution.
Oh, true. At first he did persecute the Christian, but after the revelation he experienced, Paul is the apostle who spread the gospel among non-Jews. Okay? He is maybe not the first one, but undoubtedly the most prominent, most active apostle who spread the gospels among non-Jews. And Paul actually took advantage of the net of synagogues to spread the gospels among non-Jews. This is what you see here. There were synagogues all around the Mediterranean Sea, and when Paul arrives in a city, the first thing he does is to seek for the synagogue. Okay? We also have archaeological remains from the synagogue. This is what you see here in different places in Judea. Remains of synagogues were uncovered. So until now, what you see here is the synagogue from Bourgel. South Jerusalem. And actually, it's interesting to see that synagogues share common architectural features. You see square benches which create an open space. Why is it so important to have an open space? Because it allows either the reader of the text of the scriptures or the leader of the synagogue to speak to everyone and to be listened to. Okay? But what is important to us is that here we have clear evidence that a synagogue did exist in the land of Israel, in Judea, at the time of Jesus. Now, what was the purpose? What were the functions of the synagogue? First, maybe interesting and maybe useful to define what the synagogue is not. Okay, we talked about the temple. Unlike the temple, the synagogue is not instituted in the Torah. The synagogue does not originate from commandments of God. Obviously, historical circumstances have conducted Jews to build synagogues. It is not the dwelling place of the divine presence. Only the temple, the Holy of Holies, is the dwelling place of the divine presence, and no sacrifices are performed there. You've seen that there is only one place where Jews are allowed to perform sacrifices: the temple. So what do one do in the synagogue? The synagogue actually serves religious functions such as the reading of the sacred text. That's very important. This is a place where Jews gather at least once a week on Saturdays. Why on Saturdays? Why is so special on Saturdays? This is a Shabbat. Shabbat is a very important Jewish ceremony. This is the day of rest. This is the day when God has stopped his creation and has rested. The Jews rest during the Shabbat and they listen to the reading of the Torah. And within 1 year, they are supposed to have listened to the whole Torah. And that happened in the synagogue. This is a place where the text, the scriptures, are read. Okay? But look at this weird term, Targum. What is Targum? The scriptures are written in Hebrew. But at that time, most Jews spoke Aramaic. Aramaic is a Semitic language. It is very close to Hebrew, but it's not Hebrew. So, while telling the reading of the Hebrew scriptures, someone was translating immediately the scriptures from Hebrew to Aramaic so that people could understand. Okay? So, the reading of the scripture is definitely the most important function of the synagogue, but the synagogue serves also for community function, such as school, meeting place, communal, dining area. And when we think about the very purpose of the synagogue, it's raison d'être. It could be that a synagogue appeared in order to allow Jews, even those who live far from the temple, to live out their religiosity. Think about that. A Jew that lives in Egypt or in Syria is likely to visit the temple maybe once in his lifetime. So what does he do during the rest of his life? He goes to the synagogue, because this is a place where he expresses his faith, where he hears the scriptures. The temple is central, for sure. The temple is the central place of worship. But the synagogue feels the need. The need specifically. It doesn't mean that there are no synagogues around the temple. There were synagogues. But it could well be that synagogue appears in order to answer this need. What does the Jew do? Even a Jew like Jesus, who lives in Galilee. It takes a few days from Galilee to go from Galilee to Jerusalem. So in their daily life, Jews go to the synagogue. And quite naturally, after the destruction of the temple, the synagogue becomes a central place of worship and community. It does not replace the temple. As we have seen, no sacrifices are performed in the synagogue. But it doesn't allow Jews to keep practicing Judaism after the destruction of the temple, and even today. I mean, if you look for a Jewish community, you will see that the center of the Jewish community is the synagogue. Okay? Good. So, here is the last part of my talk, Jewish movement in the Second Temple period. And here again, we'll turn to the writings of Flavius Josephus. Flavius Josephus is our main primary source. What does Josephus say about the Judaism of his time? Josephus said that the Judaism is divided into different sects, different movements. Of course, those movements share common beliefs, but they also disagree. They disagree mainly on their respective interpretation of the law, of the Quran. This is what we see. So those are the three main movements, according to Josephus: the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Essenes. And we'll say a few words about each of those groups. And again, we have to keep in mind that Christianity, as it appears, Jesus movement, is just one of those groups. There were many more groups. Jesus movement is just one of those groups. And Jesus actually responded to the issues that were dealt with by those people. Okay? Just a word about Josephus. Josephus tells that when he was a young man, in his youth, he learned a strict school of philosophy. But that eventually he decided to adhere to the school of the Pharisees. What does it tell us about the value of his testimony? On the one hand, we have first-hand testimony because Josephus tells that he has learned from the strict schools, but on the other hand, we have to be aware that his account may be biased. It could be that Josephus is too positive regarding the Pharisees. We have to keep that in mind. When did this movement appear? It's quite unclear, but it seems that they appeared during the Hasmonean period. At least it appears that those groups were active during the Hasmonean period. Okay, so here is our representative of the Pharisees, and we'll say a few words about the Pharisees. First, regarding the name of the Pharisees. In Hebrew, the Pharisees are called Roshim. Okay, and it derives from the root arash. It could be either that is separated, and if so, what it is separated from? It could be from impurity, from sin. So if so, it means that their name had a positive connotation. But it could be as well that arash, koresh, means to interpret. And we see that the Pharisees had a reputation of being the most accurate interpreters of the law, and we see how important it was to interpret the law. Regarding their influence, according to Josephus, they were the most influential group in the land of Israel. Josephus said that the masses went after them. The Pharisees had the support of the masses. But do you remember what we said? Josephus himself was a Pharisee. So we should be cautious. It could be that Josephus exaggerated the impact of the Pharisees. And now we judge maybe the most important feature of the Pharisees. In addition to the written law of Moses, the Pharisees accepted the oral law. Remember, we saw that according to Judaism, God gave the Torah, the law, to Moses. This is a written law. Now, the Pharisees claim that another law, which is the oral law, which consists in the true interpretation of the written law. And here, in order to understand this, we have to grasp the key principle. Once the text is written, once it is fixed, immediately appears a gap between the text, which is static, and the historical circumstances that keep changing all the time. This is especially true for law writings of law. So given this, how do you ensure that the law will be applied in all circumstances? What do the Pharisees say? They said that they had an oral law which enabled them to apply and to interpret the law, the Torah, in all circumstances. And they claim that when Moses received the Torah written on Mount Sinai, he received as well the oral law that was passed down generation after generation till the Pharisees received it. Okay? And actually in the Gospels, the Pharisees are portrayed. The primary, maybe the most prominent opponents of Jesus. And one of the issues that is discussed between Jesus and the Pharisees regarding the authority to interpret the law. The Pharisees claim that they have the law that originated from God. That their claims. And Jesus answered them that no, their laws are human laws. Okay, just a word, and I'll be brief, about their beliefs. We see that the Pharisees believe in the immortality of the soul, rewards and punishment in the world to come, and resurrection of the dead. Just talk briefly about the three first beliefs. Those beliefs have to do with the end of the world. Many Jews at the time are convinced that the end is near. God is the creator of all things, is also the creator of history, but soon God will put an end to the world he has created. Why so? Because this world is evil, this world is bad. And many Jews share what we could call eschatological beliefs that deals with the end of the days. And the question is, what will happen at the end of the days? What will the Pharisees say? That at the end of the day, the dead body will be resurrected, and everyone will receive according to his deeds. It means that the just will receive the rewards he deserves, while the evil people will receive their punishment. But you see here that those beliefs are very close to the beliefs of Jesus. The resurrection of the dead. What does Jesus say? That the end is near, that soon the kingdom of God will come. That's exactly the same conception of history. That history will have an end, and that the end is near. And it changes all your perspective of life when you believe that this world is evil and that soon it will be destroyed. Okay, at last, finish with the Pharisees. The Pharisees will survive the destruction of the temple. And actually, today's Judaism, what we call Rabbinic Judaism, is considered to be the heir of the philosophy of the Pharisees. And why so? What did enable the Pharisees to survive the destruction of the temple? It was because of the focus they put on the interpretation and the study of the Torah. Of course, they did participate in worship in the temple, but they put their focus in the study of the Torah. The Torah was not destroyed, it's what you see. But therefore, they did survive. A few words about the Sadducees. Sadducees are the second group. When it comes to the Pharisees, we face a problem. Why? Because they left no written documents on their own. All what we know about the Sadducees, is what their opponent had written about them. Gospels, Josephus, so it could be that the impression we get, the portrayal of the Sadducees is biased, it's too negative, and we have to keep that in mind. Okay, I'll leave that for now, the original name, and we'll talk first about their social stages. It seems that the Sadducees were less influential than the Pharisees, and yet they had some influence. Why? Because first they were closely associated with the high priest. The high priest at the time of Jesus can belong to the movement of the Sadducees, which means that the Sadducees to some extent control the temple. It was the base of their power. And the second point is that the Sadducees were closely associated with the local Roman authorities. The Sadducees, which belonged to the aristocracy, did collaborate with the Romans. Romans and Sadducees had a common interest. The Roman authorities and the Sadducees were interested in calming the tension, in pacifying the land of Israel, Judea, and it is not surprising that the Sadducees took an active part in the arrest of Jesus. As soon as they see a troublemaker, and Jesus was seen as a troublemaker, the Sadducees seek to arrest him and to hand him over to the Roman authorities. Now, regarding to their beliefs, we see that the Pharisees reject the oral law of the Pharisees. They believe that the oral law of the Pharisees is the human creation. And I skip the following one. They reject the immortality of the soul. They reject the concept of individual retribution in the afterlife and the resurrection. So you see that the Sadducees, which may be quite surprising, believe only in the existence of this world. They do not believe in the afterlife. And actually, if you go through the Hebrew Bible, you see that very few references to the afterlife. So the Sadducees believe only in the existence of this world. And it seems that it disappeared after the destruction of the temple. The movement dies out, probably because of the loss of the temple. And so they lose the base of their power. Now the Essenes. The Essenes are different from the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Essenes are ascetics. And here actually we have three sources of information. In addition to Josephus, a philosopher named Philo, and a Jewish philosopher named Philo, and a Roman author named Pliny the Elder. And they all give some important information about the Essenes. This is what we'll see. Okay, I'll skip that. Okay. The Essenes practice communal life. They live apart from the society. According to Josephus, there were settlements of Essenes in every city. According to Philo, they actually fled from the city. And Pliny tells us, actually, a very important information. According to Pliny, there was settlement of Essenes on the seashore of the Dead Sea, on the shore of the Dead Sea, and we'll see why it's so important. Their society was a hierarchical society divided into 4 classes. They live in community of goods. It means that there was no private property. And it does recall what happened in the Mother Church, in the first church in Jerusalem, where they held property in common. So it's a communist society. Celibacy. Did they practice celibacy? That's the question. Josephus said that the society, the Essene society, was a male society composed of men who practiced celibacy, but he adds that there is another group of Essenes who marry for the sake of procreation. This question of celibacy is problematic because it's written in the Bible that you have to procreate. That's a commandment. So this question is quite problematic. And regarding their beliefs, they were very strict in their adherence to the Torah. And you see that they believe in the immortality of the soul and individual retribution in the afterlife. The Essenes, like the Pharisees, believe in the afterlife and believe that the end is near, that soon God will put an end to this world. Now there is a question regarding the Essenes. It could be that we traced the Essenes through sensational discovery that was made in the last century, in the mid of the last centuries, around the site of Qumran, when scrolls were discovered in caves around the site of Qumran, see, very on the shore of the Dead Sea. And it could be that those scrolls were owned by a community of Essenes. What were those scrolls? See, there were over 900 manuscripts. So a large part of them were biblical books, but we have also what is called sectarian books, meaning that books that reflect the way of life of the people who owned these and who were responsible for hiding, for storing those manuscripts. And we see that there is a great correspondence between what Josephus and Philo tells us about the Essenes and what we find in those scriptures. Communal life, separatism, the common property. So it could be that those scrolls belonged to a community of Essenes. But this is the site of Qumran that was there, and obviously that was the seat of, actually that's the majority view, that was the seat of a community of Essenes. And, okay, that the last thing that we'll see today, Josephus adds to the three movements we've seen. The fourth one, he called the fourth philosophy. Why the fourth philosophy? Because it appears after the three that he has mentioned. What does he tell about the fourth philosophy? He said they were very similar to the Pharisees, except for two things. The law of freedom and the absolute and exclusive sovereignty of God. What does it mean? It means that for the members of this philosophy, fighting against the Romans is a duty. If you don't fight against the Romans, first you're deprived of your liberty to worship God. And two, it means that you acknowledge that the emperor, the Roman emperor, is the ruler. Well, there is only one ruler, which is God. Those people, like many of the Jews, believe that the end is near. Believe that soon God will put an end to this world. But in contradistinction to the rest of the Jews, they believe that they can take an active part in this process that will lead to the end of the world. They believe that if they fight God, if they fight the Romans, they will accelerate the process that will lead to the end of the world. And those people actually will gain influence and will contribute to spark the Great Revolt in the year 66. So you see, this is a portrayal of the political and religious landscape that Jesus experienced. And to finish, again, we have to remember that Jesus' movement, as it appeared, was just one of those groups. And it's much later, at the end of a very complex and multiple process, that Christianity, Jesus' movement, will become a religion distinct from Judaism. Okay, that's something that we have to believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. Lecture, and I think we still have time for some questions, some answers. Maybe we can learn more deeper about some aspects of the presentation. Who would like to ask the first question? Please think about that. Maybe I will ask the first one just to start. What was the role of women in the time you spoke about? The role in the temple, in the synagogue, and in the movement. How were Jewish women involved in all this?
That's a tricky question. It's hard to as you saw, the women had no access for purely question, the way it was presented. They had no access to the inner court of the temple. This is what we see. Of course, there were no women priests. Regarding the Essenes, we feel that there is a question. Was the community of the Essenes a masculine group, a masculine community, or did women also take part? It's quite hard to say. Obviously, they didn't have major functions. But again, this is another question that I have deeply studied, but it seemed that their role was not a major role. It's different in the church. In the first, I guess you could say more about that. In the mother church, no, I think it's the same. Women did not take part in the leading of the mother church.
But still, Jewish women are important part.
So I'm sorry.
One more question. I know you thought about 这个你们，我知道你们以前已经想好了，所以谁要问，即使用中文也可以。这样，English or
So actually, Jews believe that the Messiah, Jesus is considered to be the Messiah in Christianity. He's considered. Jews don't believe in Jesus, and they do expect the coming of the Messiah. That is the deliverer that will be sent by God, but they do not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Okay, but the hope, or their expectancy for the coming of the Messiah, is still part of Judaism. Judaism think that at the end of the day, God will send His Messiah. Messiah is the Redeemer. He will be the one who will put an end to this world. Okay?
One more question? 谁还要问问题？好的。
Thank you, Yo老师. Okay. My question is, the temple is destroyed, and nowadays, do Jewish people still have priests, or they just have rabbi? Rabbi is the same position with the priest.
Well, with the destruction of the temple, priesthood actually disappeared. I mean, it lost its function. And a rabbi is not a priest. A rabbi is the head of the community, but he's not a priest. Anyone can become a rabbi. As we said, priesthood is accessed only through genealogy. But still, you may meet some people who are called Kohen. I don't know if you heard about this name. Kohen is a common Jewish name. Kohen in Hebrew means priest, so it could be that those people who are named Kohen are descendants of priests, but they do not have official functions. There is one prayer, it's for remembrance of the temple. It's called Birkat HaKohanim, blessing of the priest, during Yom Kippur, when the people who are called Kohen take part in the prayer. But again, they do not have official functions. No, the community is headed by a rabbi, but he's only the chief of the community. He's not a priest.
Okay. So the priest transitions to inherit in nowadays, but there is no function.
No, because the main function of the priest is to perform sacrifices. There are no more sacrifices. So they lost this function. But as I said, for remembrance of the temple, they have some symbolic roles.
I'm curious about something else. You spoke about the first temple, the second one. What about the third temple?
So again, it's part of the eschatological beliefs that at the end of the day, the third temple will be rebuilt. But there is only a very tiny minority of Jews who actively act in order to bring the building. because it's a very sensitive political issue. Now we will show you. This slide. Here. What you see here, so this is the Temple Mount. This is where the temple stood at the time of Jesus, but now there is the third holiest Muslim site. You see, this is the Dome of the Rock. Next to the Dome of the Rock is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So it's a very sensitive spot because it's holy not only to Jews but also to Muslims. So building a third temple would mean somehow get rid of the Dome of the Rock, and it's a very sensitive issue. So there is only a tiny Jewish minority who is actively acting in order to bring to the building of a third temple, but for most of the Jews, it's just a remote belief that will happen at the end of the day. It's not something that we have to achieve now.
It's today, but the idea was actually easy. Yeah, also the
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you read Ezekiel, there is a belief that at the end of the day there will be a temple, different temple. In the Revelation of John, there is the heavenly Jerusalem, something that was shared by some Jews and Christians.
谁还有问题？ Who wants to ask a question? Okay, I have one other question because you spoke about Sadducees, and there are more sources, but actually they should be in position to have some sources because they had a very good contact to Hellenistic, to Greek culture. They were also they participated in the political life, so actually should be a source. There's nothing.
It's very frustrating that there is no source that has come out to us. For sure they had writings, for sure they did interpret the text. What we know, that it seems that they had very literal reading of the Torah, of the law, but they left no written documents. So it's frustrating, but I think all that we know about them, what comes from Josephus, from the New Testament, maybe from the Qumran scrolls as well, but we have nothing that comes from slaves.
Maybe something will be discovered.
Hopefully.
Thank you. I already
I have a question about the Jewish scripture. You mentioned that they studied the Torah in synagogue, and I believe that in the New Testament, Jesus read from the prophets, prophetic prophets as well in this synagogue. So, what's the status of this prophetic books in those times?
The Torah is the holiest part, that's for sure. The Torah is read every week according to the repetition. And within a year, you're supposed to have listened to the whole Torah. Prophets are partly read. After the reading of the Torah, it is common to read parts of the prophet. And that's exactly what you said. Actually, Jesus said is reported to have read from the book of Isaiah. So they have a lesser importance, but they are very important as well. The holiest part, there is no discussion, is the Torah, the 5 first book of the Hebrew Bible.
Thank you.
Just a chance for the last question. 还有机会问我们最后的一个问题。 好，一切都清楚吗 ？No questions? First of all, thank you so much once more. Please a big applause. You can see there is on the door. There are also dates for other lectures. They are invited also for to other lectures. 26th of March, there is 古代的犹太基督主讲 and the April there is 耶稣时代的耶路撒冷。对I think it's a good experience also 这个所以看他们的练习就听多一点英文所以大家会有一个好的发展的一个机会。Thank you so much also for attending this lecture, and we'll meet with the students next week. If somebody has still some questions, can ask our TA. And now we are at the end of the lecture. Please once more a big applause. Thank you so much.